George Washington, February 22, 1732, OS February 11, 1731 A. December 14, 1799, was a founding father and the first president of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797 as commander of the Continental Army. Washington led Patriot forces to victory in the American Revolutionary War against the British Empire. He is commonly known as the Father of the Nation for his role in bringing about American independence. Born in the colony of Virginia, Washington became the commander of the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War 1754-1763. He was later elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses and opposed the perceived oppression of the American colonists by the British Crown. When the American Revolutionary War against the British began in 1775, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He directed a poorly organized and equipped force against disciplined British troops. Washington and his army achieved an early victory at the Siege of Boston in March 1776, but were forced to retreat from New York City in November. Washington crossed the Delaware River and won the battles of Trenton in late 1776 and of Princeton in early 1777, then lost the battles of Brandywine and of Germantown later that year. He faced criticism of his command, low troop morale, and a lack of provisions for his forces as the war continued. Ultimately, Washington led a combined French and American force to a decisive victory over the British at Yorktown in 1781. In the resulting Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British acknowledged the sovereign independence of the United States. Washington then served as president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, which drafted the current Constitution of the United States. Washington was unanimously elected the first U.S. president by the Electoral College in 1788 and 1792. He implemented a strong, well-financed national government while remaining impartial in the fierce rivalry that emerged within his cabinet between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. During the French Revolution, he proclaimed a policy of neutrality. While supporting the Jay Treaty with Britain, Washington set enduring precedents for the office of president, including republicanism, a peaceful transfer of power, the use of the title Mr. President, and the two-term tradition. His 1796 farewell address became a preeminent statement on republicanism. Washington wrote about the importance of national unity and the dangers that regionalism, partisanship, and foreign influence posed to it. As a planter of tobacco and wheat at Mount Vernon, Washington owned many slaves. He began opposing slavery near the end of his life and provided in his will for the eventual manumission of his slaves. Washington's image is an icon of American culture, and he has been extensively memorialized. His namesakes include the national capital and the state of Washington. In both popular and scholarly polls, he is consistently considered one of the greatest presidents in American history. Early life 1732 to 1752. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the first of 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His father was a justice of the peace and a prominent public figure, who had 4 additional children from his first marriage to Jane Butler. Washington was not close to his father and rarely mentioned him in later years. He had a fractious relationship with his mother. Among his siblings, he was particularly close to his older half-brother. The family moved to a plantation on Little Hunting Creek in 1735, before settling at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1738. When Augustine died in 1743, Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. Because of his father's death, Washington did not have the formal education his elder half-brothers had received at Appleby Grammar School in England. He instead attended the Lower Church School in Hartfield. He learned mathematics and land surveying and became a talented draftsman and mapmaker. By early adulthood, he was writing with what his biographer, Ron Chernow, described as considerable force and precision. As a teenager, Washington compiled over 100 rules for social interaction, styled the Rules of Civility. copied from an English translation of a French guidebook. Washington often visited Beaver, the plantation of William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law, and Mount Vernon. Fairfax became Washington's patron and surrogate father. In 1748, Washington spent a month with a team surveying Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. The following year, he received a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary. Even though Washington had not served the customary apprenticeship, Thomas Fairfax, William's cousin, appointed him surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia. Washington took his oath of office on July 20, 1749, and resigned in 1750. By 1752, he had bought almost 1,500 acres seiscientas in the Shenandoah Valley and owned 2,315 acres, 937 a. In 1751, Washington left mainland North America for the first and only time, when he accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. Washington contracted smallpox during the trip, which left his face slightly scarred. Lawrence died in 1752, and Washington leased Mount Vernon from his widow, Anne. He inherited it outright after her death in 1761. Colonial military career, 1752 to 1758. Lawrence Washington's service as Adjutant General of the Virginia Militia inspired George to seek a militia commission. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed Washington as a major and commander of one of the 4 militia districts. The British and French were competing for control of the Ohio River Valley. The British were constructing forts along the river, and the French between the river and Lake Erie. In October 1753, Dinwiddie appointed Washington as a special envoy to demand the French forces vacate land that was claimed by the British. Washington was also directed to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and to gather intelligence about the French forces. Washington met with Iroquois leader Tanacharison at Logstown. Washington said that at this meeting Tanacharison named him Kanakarizon. This name, meaning devourer of villages, had previously been given to his great-grandfather, John Washington, in the late 17th century by the Susquehannock. Washington's party reached the Ohio River in November 1753 and was intercepted by a French patrol. The party was escorted to Fort LeBoeuf, where Washington was received in a friendly manner. He delivered the British demand to vacate to the French commander, Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, but the French refused to leave. Saint-Pierre gave Washington his official answer after a few days' delay, as well as food and winter clothing for his party's journey back to Virginia. Washington completed the precarious mission in difficult winter conditions, achieving a measure of distinction when his report was published in Virginia and London. French and Indian War. In February 1754, Dinwiddie promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 300-strong Virginia Regiment, with orders to confront the French at the forks of the Ohio. Washington set out with half the regiment in April and was soon aware that French force of 1,000 had begun construction of Fort Duquesne there. In May, having established a defensive position at Great Meadows, Washington learned that the French had made camp 7 miles 11 kilometers away. He decided to take the offensive. The French detachment proved to be only about 50 men, so on May 28, Washington commanded an ambush. His small force of Virginians and Indian allies killed the French, including their commander, Joseph Cowlin de Jumonville, who had been carrying a diplomatic message for the British. The French later found their countrymen dead and scalped, blaming Washington, who had retreated to Fort Necessity. The rest of the Virginia regiment joined Washington the following month with news that he had been promoted to the rank of colonel and given command of the full regiment. They were reinforced by an independent company of 100 South Carolinians led by Captain James McKay. His royal commission outranked Washington's, and a conflict of command ensued. On July 3, 900 French soldiers attacked Fort Necessity, and the ensuing battle ended in Washington's surrender. Washington did not speak French, but signed a surrender document in which he unwittingly took responsibility for assassinating Johnville, later blaming the translator for not properly translating it. The Virginia regiment was divided, and Washington was offered a captaincy in one of the newly formed regiment. He refused, as it would have been a demotion. The British had ordered that colonials could not be ranked any higher than Captain and instead resigned his commission. The Jumonville affair became the incident which ignited the French and Indian War. In 1755, Washington volunteered as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to expel the French from Fort Duquesne and the Ohio country. On Washington's recommendation, Braddock split the army into one main column and a smaller flying column. Washington was suffering from severe dysentery, so did not initially travel with the expedition forces. When he rejoined Braddock at Monongahela, still very ill, the French and their Indian allies ambushed the divided army. 2/3 of the British force became casualties in the ensuing Battle of the Monongahela, and Braddock was killed. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, Washington rallied the survivors and formed a rearguard, allowing the remnants of the force to retreat. During the engagement, Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his hat and coat were pierced by bullets. His conduct redeemed his reputation among critics of his command in the Battle of Fort Necessity, but he was not included by the succeeding commander, Colonel Thomas Dunbar, in planning subsequent operations. The Virginia Regiment was reconstituted in August 1755, and Dinwiddie appointed Washington its commander. Again, with the rank of colonel, Washington clashed over seniority almost immediately, this time with Captain John Dagworthy, who commanded a detachment of Marylanders at the regiment's headquarters in Fort Cumberland. Washington, impatient for an offensive against Fort Duquesne, was convinced Braddock would have granted him a royal commission, and pressed his case in February 1756 with Braddock's successor as commander-in-chief, William Shirley, and again in January 1757 with Shirley's successor, Lord Loudon. Loudon humiliated Washington, refused him a royal commission, and agreed only to relieve him of the responsibility of manning Fort Cumberland. In 1758, the Virginia Regiment was assigned to the British Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. General John Forbes took Washington's advice on some aspects of the expedition, but rejected his opinion on the best route to the fort. Forbes, nevertheless, made Washington a brevet brigadier general and gave him command of one of the 3 brigades that was assigned to assault the fort. The French had abandoned the fort and the valley before the assault, however, and Washington only saw a friendly fire incident which left 14 dead and 26 injured. Frustrated, he resigned his commission soon afterwards and returned to Mount Vernon. Under Washington, the Virginia Regiment had defended 300 miles, 480 kilometers, of frontier against 20 Indian attacks in 10 months. He increased the professionalism of the regiment as it grew from 300 to 1,000 men. Though he failed to realize a royal commission, which made him hostile towards the British, he gained self-confidence, leadership skills, and knowledge of British military tactics. The destructive competition Washington witnessed among colonial politicians fostered his later support of a strong central government. Marriage, civilian and political life, 1759 to 1775. On January 6, 1759, Washington, at age 26, married Martha Dandridge Custis, the 27-year-old widow of wealthy plantation owner Daniel Park Custis. Martha was intelligent, gracious, and experienced in managing a planter's estate, and the couple had a happy marriage. They lived at Mount Vernon, where Washington cultivated tobacco and wheat. At Washington's urging, Governor Lord Boudetort fulfilled Dinwiddie's 1754 promise to grant land bounties to those who served with volunteer militias during the French and Indian War. In late 1770, Washington inspected the lands in the Ohio and Great Kanawha regions, and he engaged surveyor William Crawford to subdivide it. Crawford allotted 23,200 acres, 9,4 ha, to Washington, who told the veterans that their land was unsuitable for farming and agreed to purchase 20,147 acres, 8,153 hectares, leaving some feeling that they had been duped. He also doubled the size of Mount Vernon to 6,500 acres, 2,6 ha, and, by 1775, had more than doubled its slave population to over 100. As a respected military hero and large landowner, Washington held local offices and was elected to the Virginia Provincial Legislature, representing Frederick County in the Virginia House of Burgesses for 7 years, beginning in 1758. Early in his legislative career, Washington rarely spoke at or even attended legislative sessions, but was more politically active starting in the 1760s, becoming a prominent critic of Britain's taxation and mercantilist policies towards the American colonies. Washington imported luxury goods from England, paying for them by exporting tobacco. His profligate spending, combined with low tobacco prices, left him £1,800 in debt by 1764. Washington's complete reliance on London tobacco buyer and merchant Robert Carey also threatened his economic security. Between 1764 and 1766, he sought to diversify his holdings. He changed Mount Vernon's primary cash crop from tobacco to wheat and expanded operations to include flour milling and hemp farming. Washington's stepdaughter, Patsy, suffered from epileptic attacks, and she died at Mount Vernon in 1773. Allowing Washington to use part of the inheritance from her estate to settle his debts. Opposition to the British Parliament and Crown Washington was opposed to the taxes which the British Parliament imposed on the colonies without proper representation. He believed the Stamp Act, 1765, was oppressive and celebrated its repeal the following year. In response to the Townshend Acts, he introduced a proposal in May 1769 which urged Virginians to boycott British goods. The Townshend Acts were mostly repealed in 1770. Washington and other colonists were also angered by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains, and British interference in American Western land speculation, in which Washington was a participant. Parliament sought to punish Massachusetts colonists for their role in the Boston Tea Party in 1774 by passing the Coercive Acts, which Washington saw as an invasion of our rights and privileges. That July, he and George Mason drafted a list of resolutions for the Fairfax County Committee, including a call to end the Atlantic slave trade. The resolutions were adopted. In August, Washington attended the First Virginia Convention and was selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. As tensions rose in 1774, he helped train militias in Virginia and organized enforcement of the Continental Association. Boycott of British goods instituted by the Congress. Siege of Boston in April 1775. In response to the growing rebellious movement, British troops occupied Boston, led by General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in America. Local militia surrounded the city and trapped the British troops, resulting in a standoff. As Washington headed for Boston, he was greeted by cheering crowds and political ceremony. He became a symbol of the patriot cause. Upon Washington's arrival on July 2nd, he went to inspect the army, but found undisciplined militia. After consultation, he initiated Benjamin Franklin's suggested reforms, instituting military drills and imposing strict disciplinary measures. Washington promoted some of the soldiers who had performed well at Bunker Hill to officer rank and removed officers who he saw as incompetent. In October, King George III declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and relieved Gage of command, replacing him with General William Howe. When the Charles River froze over, Washington was eager to cross and storm Boston. But Gates and others were opposed to having untrained militia attempt to assault well-garrisoned fortifications. Instead, Washington agreed to secure the Dorchester Heights above Boston to try to force the British out. On March 17, 8,906 British troops, 1,100 loyalists, and 1,220 women and children began a chaotic naval evacuation. Washington entered the city with 500 men, giving them explicit orders not to plunder. He refrained from exerting military authority in Boston, leaving civilian matters in the hands of local authorities. Battle of Long Island. After the victory at Boston, Washington correctly guessed that the British would return to New York City and retaliate. He arrived there on April 13, 1776, and ordered the construction of fortifications. He also ordered his forces to treat civilians and their property with respect. To avoid the abuses Bostonians suffered at the hands of British troops, the British forces including more than 100 ships and thousands of troops, began arriving on Staten Island in July to lay siege to the city. Howe's troop strength totaled 32,000 regulars and Hessian auxiliaries. Washington had 23,000 men, mostly untrained recruits and militia. In August, Howe landed 20,000 troops at Gravesend, Brooklyn, and approached Washington's fortifications. Overruling his generals, Washington chose to fight, based on inaccurate information that Howe's army had only around 8,000 soldiers. In the Battle of Long Island, Howe assaulted Washington's flank and inflicted 1,500 Patriot casualties. Washington retreated to Manhattan. Howe sent a message to Washington to negotiate peace, addressing him as George Washington-esque. Washington declined to accept the message, demanding to be addressed with diplomatic protocol. As a rebel, despite misgivings, Washington heeded the advice of General Greene to defend Fort Washington, but was ultimately forced to abandon it. Howe pursued and Washington retreated across the Hudson River to Fort Lee. In November, Howe captured Fort Washington. Loyalists in New York City considered Howe a liberator and spread a rumor that Washington had set fire to the city. Now reduced to 5,400 troops, Washington's army retreated through New Jersey. Crossing the Delaware, Trenton, and Princeton, Washington crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where General John Sullivan joined him with 2,000 more troops. The future of the Continental Army was in doubt due to a lack of supplies, a harsh winter, expiring enlistments, and desertions. Howe posted a Hessian garrison at Trenton to hold western New Jersey and the east shore of the Delaware. At sunrise on December 26, 1776, Washington, aided by Colonel Knox and artillery, led his men in a successful surprise attack on the Hessians. Washington returned to New Jersey on January 3, 1777, launching an attack on the British regulars at Princeton. With 40 Americans killed or wounded and 273 British killed or captured, Howe retreated to New York City for the winter. Washington took up winter headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey. Strategically, Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton were pivotal. They revived Patriot morale and quashed the British strategy of showing overwhelming force followed by offering generous terms, changing the course of the war. Brandywine, Germantown, and Saratoga. Main articles: Battle of Brandywine, Battle of Germantown, and Battles of Saratoga. In July 1777, the British General John Burgoyne led his British troops south from Quebec in the Saratoga campaign. He recaptured Fort Ticonderoga, intending to divide New England. However, General Howe took his army from New York City south to Philadelphia, rather than joining Burgoyne near Albany. Washington and Gilbert, Marquis de Lafayette, rushed to Philadelphia to engage Howe in the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. Howe outmaneuvered Washington and marched unopposed into the American capital at Philadelphia. A Patriot attack against the British at Germantown in October failed. In upstate New York, the Patriots were led by General Horatio Gates. Concerned about Burgoyne's movements southward, Washington sent reinforcements north with Generals Benedict Arnold and Benjamin Lincoln. On October 7, 1777, Burgoyne tried to take Bemis Heights, but was isolated from support and forced to surrender. Gates' victory emboldened Washington's critics, who favored Gates as a military leader. According to the biographer John Alden, it was inevitable that the defeats of Washington's forces and the concurrent victory of the forces in Upper New York should be compared. Admiration for Washington was waning. Valley Forge and Monmouth, Washington, and his army of 11,000 men went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, north of Philadelphia, in December 1777. There they lost between 2,000 and 3,000 men as a result of disease and lack of food, clothing, and shelter, reducing the army to below 9,000 men. By February, Washington was facing low troop morale and increased desertions. An internal revolt by his officers prompted some members of Congress to consider removing Washington from command. Washington supporters resisted, and the matter was ultimately dropped. Washington made repeated petitions to Congress for provisions and expressed the urgency of the situation to a congressional delegation. Congress agreed to strengthen the Army's supply lines and reorganize the quartermaster and commissary departments, while Washington launched the Grand Forage of 1778 to collect food from the surrounding region. Meanwhile, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben's incessant drilling transformed Washington's recruits into a disciplined fighting force. Washington appointed him Inspector General. In early 1778, the French entered into a treaty of alliance with the Americans. 119 in May, Howe resigned and was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton. The British evacuated Philadelphia for New York that June, and Washington summoned a war council of American and French generals. He chose to order a limited strike on the retreating British. Generals Lee and Lafayette moved with 4,000 men without Washington's knowledge and bungled their first strike on June 28. Washington relieved Lee and achieved a draw after an expansive battle. The British continued their retreat to New York. This battle marked the end of the war's campaigning in the northern and middle states. Washington would not fight the British in a major engagement again for more than 3 years. British attention shifted to the Southern theater. In late 1778, General Clinton captured Savannah, Georgia, a key port in the American South. Washington, meanwhile, ordered an expedition against the Iroquois, the indigenous allies of the British, destroying their villages. Espionage, and West Point. Washington became America's first spy master by designing an espionage system against the British. In 1778, Major Benjamin Talmadge formed the Copa Ring at Washington's direction to covertly collect information about the British in New York. Intelligence from the Copa Ring saved French forces from a surprise British attack, which was itself based on intelligence from Washington's general-turned-British spy, Benedict Arnold. Washington had disregarded incidents of disloyalty by Arnold, who had distinguished himself in many campaigns, including the invasion of Quebec. In 1779, Arnold began supplying the British spymaster John with sensitive information intended to allow the British to capture West Point, a key American defensive position on the Hudson River. On September 21st, Arnold gave plans to take over the garrison, was captured by militia, who discovered the plans, after which Arnold escaped to New York. On being told about Arnold's treason, Washington recalled the commanders positioned under Arnold at key points around the fort to prevent any complicity. He assumed personal command at West Point and reorganized its defenses. Southern Theater and Yorktown. By June 1780, the British had occupied the South Carolina Piedmont and had firm control of the South. Washington was reinvigorated. However, when Lafayette returned from France with more ships, men, and supplies, and 5,000 veteran French troops, led by Marshal Rochambeau, arrived at Newport, Rhode Island, in July, General Clinton sent Arnold, now a British brigadier general, to Virginia in December with 1,700 troops to capture Portsmouth and conduct raids on Patriot forces. Washington sent Lafayette south to counter Arnold's efforts. Washington initially hoped to bring the fight to New York, drawing the British forces away from Virginia and ending the war there. But Rochambeau advised him that Cornwallis in Virginia was the better target. On August 19, 1781, Washington and Rochambeau began a march to Yorktown, Virginia, known now as the Celebrated March. Washington was in command of an army of 7,800 Frenchmen, 3,100 militia, and 8,000 Continental troops. Inexperienced in siege warfare, he often deferred to the judgment of Rochambeau. Despite this, Rochambeau never challenged Washington's authority as the battle's commanding officer. By late September, Patriot French forces surrounded Yorktown, trapping the British Army, while the French Navy emerged victorious at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The final American offensive began with a shot fired by Washington. The siege ended with a British surrender on October 19, 1781. Over 7,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war. Demobilization and resignation. When peace negotiations began in April 1782, both the British and French began gradually evacuating their forces. In March 1783, Washington successfully calmed the Newburgh Conspiracy, a planned mutiny by American officers dissatisfied with a lack of pay. Washington submitted an account of $450,000 in expenses, which he had advanced to the Army. The account was settled, though it was vague about large sums, and included expenses his wife had incurred through visits to his headquarters. When the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, Britain officially recognized American independence. Washington disbanded his army. Giving a farewell address to his soldiers on November 2, he oversaw the evacuation of British forces in New York and was greeted by parades and celebrations. In early December 1783, Washington bade farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern and resigned as commander-in-chief soon after, in a final appearance in uniform. He gave a statement to the Congress. "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God, and those who have the superintendence of them to his holy keeping." Washington's resignation was acclaimed at home and abroad, extolled by later historians as a signal event that set the country's political course. According to the historian Edward J. Larson, the same month, Washington was appointed President General of the Society of the Cincinnati, a newly established hereditary fraternity of Revolutionary War officers. Early Republic, 1783 to 1789, returned to Mount Vernon after spending just 10 days at Mount Vernon out of 812 years of war. Washington was eager to return home. He arrived on Christmas Eve. Professor John E. Furling wrote that he was delighted to be free of the bustle of a camp and the busy scenes of public life. He received a constant stream of visitors paying their respects at Mount Vernon. Washington reactivated his interests in the Great Dismal Swamp and Potomac Canal projects, begun before the war, though neither paid him any dividends. To make his estate profitable again, Washington undertook a new landscaping plan and succeeded in cultivating a range of fast-growing trees and native shrubs. He also began breeding mules after being gifted a stud by King Charles III of Spain in 1785. He believed that they would revolutionize agriculture. Constitutional Convention of 1787. Before returning to private life in June 1783, Washington called for a strong union, though he was concerned that he might be criticized for meddling in civil matters. He sent a circular letter to the states, maintaining that the Articles of Confederation were no more than a rope of sand. He believed the nation was on the verge of anarchy and confusion, was vulnerable to foreign intervention, and that a national constitution would unify the states under a strong central government. When Shays's rebellion erupted in Massachusetts in August 1786, Washington was further convinced that a national constitution was needed. Some nationalists feared that the new republic had descended into lawlessness, and they met on September 11, 1786, at Annapolis to ask the Congress to revise the Articles of Confederation. Congress agreed to a constitutional convention to be held in Philadelphia in 1787, with each state to send delegates. Washington was chosen to lead the Virginia delegation, but he declined. He had concerns about the legality of the convention and consulted James Madison, Henry Knox, and others. They persuaded him to attend, as they felt his presence might induce reluctant states to send delegates and smooth the way for the ratification process, while also giving legitimacy to the convention. Washington arrived in Philadelphia on May 9, 1787, and the convention began on May 25. Benjamin Franklin nominated Washington to preside over the meeting, and he was unanimously elected. The delegate Edmund Randolph introduced Madison's Virginia plan. It called for an entirely new constitution and a sovereign national government, which Washington highly recommended. However, details around representation were particularly contentious, resulting in a competing New Jersey plan being brought forward. On July 10, Washington wrote to Alexander Hamilton, "I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of our convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business." Nevertheless, he lent his prestige to the work of the other delegates, lobbying many to support the ratification of the Constitution. 170. The final version adopted the Connecticut Compromise between the two plans. and was signed by 39 of 55 delegates on September 17, 1787. Post-presidency, 1797 to 1799. Retirement. Washington retired to Mount Vernon in March 1797 and devoted time to his business interests. His plantation operations were minimally profitable, and his lands in the West on the Piedmont yielded little income. He attempted to sell these, but was unable to. He became an even more committed Federalist. He vocally supported the Alien and Sedition Acts and convinced Federalist John Marshall to run for Congress to weaken the Jeffersonian hold on Virginia. French privateers began seizing American ships in 1798, and deteriorating relations led to the Quasi War. Washington wrote to Secretary of War James McHenry, offering to organize President Adams' army. Adams nominated him for a lieutenant general commission and the position of commander-in-chief of the armies. On July 4, 1798, Washington served as the commanding general from July 13, 1798, until his death 17 months later. He participated in planning but delegated the active leadership of the army to Hamilton. No army invaded the United States during this period, and Washington did not assume a field command. Washington was known to be rich because of what Chernow calls the glorified facade of wealth and grandeur at Mount Vernon. However, nearly all of his wealth was in the form of land and slaves rather than ready cash. To supplement his income, he erected a distillery for whiskey production. He bought land parcels to spur development around the new federal city named in his honor in 1791. And he sold individual lots to middle-income investors rather than multiple lots to large investors, believing the former would be more likely to commit to making improvements. At the time of his death, in 1799, his estate was worth an estimated $780,000, and he held title to more than 58 deaths. On December 12, 1799, Washington inspected his farms on horseback in inclement weather for 5 hours. He then dined with guests without putting on dry clothes. He had a sore throat the next day, but was well enough to mark trees for cutting. Early the following morning, he awoke to an inflamed throat and difficulty breathing. He ordered his estate overseer, George Rawlins, to remove nearly a pint of his blood. Bloodletting was a common practice of the time. His family summoned doctors James Craik, Gustavus Richard Brown, and Elisha C. Dick. Brown initially believed Washington had quinsy. Dick thought the condition was a more serious violent inflammation of the membranes of the throat. They continued bloodletting to approximately 5 pints, but Washington's condition deteriorated further. Dick proposed a tracheotomy. The other physicians were not familiar with that procedure and disapproved. Washington instructed Brown and Dick to leave the room, while he assured Craik, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." On his deathbed, afraid of being entombed alive, Washington instructed his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to wait 3 days before his burial. According to Lear, Washington died between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on December 14, 1799, with Martha seated at the foot of his bed. His last words were, "'Tis well." The diagnosis of Washington's illness and the immediate cause of his death have been subjects of debate. The published account of Craik and Brown stated that his symptoms were consistent with Synanche trachealis, a term then used to describe severe inflammation of the upper windpipe, including quinsy. Accusations of medical malpractice have persisted since Washington's death. Modern medical authors have largely concluded that he likely died from severe epiglottitis, complicated by the treatments he was given, which included multiple doses of calomel, a purgative, and extensive bloodletting, likely resulting in hypovolemic shock. Funeral and burial. Washington's funeral was held on December 18, 1799, 4 days after his death, at Mount Vernon. Cavalry and foot soldiers led the procession, and 6 colonels served as the pallbearers. The Mount Vernon funeral service was restricted mostly to family and friends. Reverend Thomas Davis read a brief funeral service, followed by a ceremony performed by members of Washington's Masonic Lodge. Washington had been a Freemason since 1752. Word of his death traveled slowly, but as it reached other regions, church bells rang and many businesses closed. Memorial processions were held in major cities of the United States. Martha burned her correspondence with Washington to protect its privacy. Though 5 letters between the couple are known to have survived, a picture of the 2 sarcophagi of George at Wright and Martha Washington at the present tomb at Mount Vernon, the sarcophagi of George Wright and Martha Washington at the entrance to their tomb in Mount Vernon. Washington was buried in the Washington family vault at Mount Vernon on December 18, 1799. In his will, Washington left instructions for the construction of a new vault. This was completed in 1831, after a disgruntled ex-employee of the estate attempted to steal what he thought was Washington's skull. In 1832, a joint congressional committee debated moving his body from Mount Vernon to a crypt in the United States Capitol. Southern opposition was intense, antagonized by an ever-growing rift between North and South. Many were concerned that Washington's remains could end up, in the words of Representative Wiley Thompson, on a shore foreign to his native soil if the country became divided and Washington's remains stayed in Mount Vernon. On October 7, 1837, Washington's remains, still in the original lead coffin, were placed within a marble sarcophagus designed by William Strickland and constructed by John Struthers,